Hi, everyone. Back here for next lecture in Philosophy 130, or 160 rather, Intro to Ethics. And today I'm going to be talking about utilitarianism and a little bit about moral theories. So utilitarianism is a theory that says basically morality is about a matter of beneficence, just universal love, is one way to think of it initially. And they're really big on leaving no one behind. They think everyone's well-being matters and everyone you should be beneficent to everyone. So in that way, it's an appealing theory. You could start out from the idea that morality says always and only do the most beneficent thing you can. So do good, make the world a better place. From the utilitarian point of view, that's what morality is all about. And so here are some main figures in utilitarian in the history of philosophy. So in the West, we have Jeremy Bentham, who was a reformer in England. And so he's a famous quote here: the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the foundation of morals and legislation. So he was really big on reforming laws in his society and was looking for just thought we should set up legal systems and perform individual actions that promote the well-being of the most people, the greatest number of people, the most happiness we can produce. That's good, and we shouldn't do things that cause harm to people. And then one of his main followers, John Stuart Mill, he's a super famous utilitarian, probably popularized the theory more. And Mill was, but these guys were both very progressive, the way we would talk about it today. Um, and not in a contentious way, just in a way I think everyone could get behind it. Mill wrote on the subjection of women. The current thinking is he probably more or less co-wrote this or was heavily influenced by a woman he was in a long-term relationship with. And basically, this is an attack on the mistreatment of women and not treating them as equals, and arguing that was bad for women, was lowering their well-being, and it was harming society as a whole. And so utilitarians also similarly come out against other forms of prejudice. Um, Now, it's not just in the West that you find utilitarianism. Mozi is a famous Chinese philosopher, and he critiqued forms of hierarchy and prejudice against some groups and said, universal love is really the way of the sage kings. It's what bring peace to rulers and sustenance to the people. So again, these figures are interested in political reforms, political philosophy, but also individual ethics. And so you see here Mozart saying poverty is the root of disorders in the country. And so if you got interested, you can, and you'll see, we'll read a short article by James Rachels that will mention Mozart next week. So, okay, so we're going to talk about now utilitarianism as a moral theory. And so we're going to start, I want to start introducing the idea of a moral theory. I'll talk more about this as I go on. Generally, moral theories are going to have two goals. One, they want to tell you what makes actions, laws, or goals you could have, decisions you could make in your life, what makes them morally right or wrong, or what makes them, good or bad, virtuous or vicious. Uh, so they want a general account of that. And so they're going to propose a moral standard that would give you answers to when you're trying to figure out what's right or wrong, it would tell you the right answer. Um, and then the second thing moral theories will do, they want to give you some insight into how important it is to live up to a moral standard. So, you know, that's we've asked these questions. You could decide how what morality requires, and there's other question of how moral do you want to be, right? And so moral theories typically want to tell you something or other, help you think about that problem, and they'll give you some proposed answer to it. And they'll also talk about what's called moral worth. So the moral standard a theory will give you, one reason you might want a theory, what are they good for, is that they could explain and justify your assumptions about progress. So think back to the Appia. If you think we made progress because we realized slavery is wrong, well, there are people in the past who didn't think it was wrong. So you might want to be able to explain and justify the current agreement that we count as progress. So moral theory could give you that. It can help you give you a justification and explanation of and why you're right in thinking that. Um, but there are current conflicts, right? And so that we talked about that when we talked about moral relativism. There are disagreements on some moral issues. Well, the theories will say we can explain why the things everyone agrees are wrong, and it'll generate answers to conflicts. And then even if you don't end up accepting some moral theory we study, it can help you clarify moral factors that do matter for decision making. So like utilitarianism is going to say pretty much all that matters for morality is beneficence, doing good. You might not end up accepting that. You might accept the way they think of it, but by studying the theory, clearly beneficence is part of morality, and doing good for others is important morally. So by thinking about a theory and its limits, you can figure out kind of your own positive view, even if you reject the theory. Then also, I thinking about moral commitment and worth, you can figure out where do you want to set your moral standard. Do you, how what do you think is morally good and bad, and then you can say how committed are you to living up to it. And we'll talk about that when we get to the theories of the good life. There might be costs to you. You might make sacrifices, right? So we'll think about that question. And then how should you react to moral shortcomings or excellences in yourself or other people around you? So these are the things a moral theory will help you think about. They'll propose answers. You can figure out whether you think they're right. And then even if you don't, you can still learn more about your own view. So when you run into a moral theory, here are the things you're going to want to do. You're going to want to think about cases where you have a judgment about what's morally right or wrong. Does the theory track your answers? Does it sort of fit your initial thoughts about what was right or wrong in cases? Um, then if it does it adequately explain why the things are right or wrong in the cases that you care about? If you disagree with it, you'll have to think about why you think it's wrong and what alternative you'd prefer. You might think that it captures a part of the truth that can improve your moral reasoning. So even if you don't accept it, you want to ask this question: how could I learn something from this theory? What does it teach me about the truth? And then the theories, I think, in general, will pressure you to get more consistent in your thinking about different types of cases. Will be introducing new case for you to think about you probably never thought about before. So you could try to think about, is my thinking consistent here, and how can I deepen my own moral thinking, about the standard I want to endorse and how moral I want to be. So that's the point of studying the theories. And now, so we'll just talk about utilitarianism. The article by R.M. Hare gives you a nice, clear statement of three main components that classically you can break down the utilitarian moral theory into. So here are the components: consequentialism, welfarism, and aggregation. So again, these are not common sense. You don't wander around in your daily life saying, hey, I really was thinking about welfarism today. People won't know what you're talking about. They're technical terms. So when you run into a technical term, uh, you need to look at what the author says about them. Try to get clear on them in your own mind so that you could give in your own words, you can paraphrase what they're saying so you can get a grip on it. Maybe try to explain it to somebody else if you really wanted to. You could try that. If you have someone else in the class, that would make sense. But the basic idea here is you want to get clear on these concepts behind the words. That's the key thing. So, okay, what is consequentialism? So consequentialism says all and only the impacts of your actions or what you don't do, your impact on the future states of the world are what matter morally. So the consequences of what you do or don't do. So that's the future, the impact on the way the future is going to be. That's what matters morally. So think about it, there's the past, you're in the present, you can perform actions of various type or not, and there's the future. And so consequentialism says the morality of what you do or don't do hinges on the way that shapes the way the future is going to be. So it's not going to give any, it's not going to say, oh, in order to figure out whether something is moral, you should sort of look backwards at what happened in the past. That's not right. It's a forward-looking moral theory. Um, the other thing to notice is it's saying the consequences of your actions matter. So your intentions are not going to play a huge role in determining what's morally right or wrong here. So you might think, people say all the time, hell's paved with good intentions. So an example we'll talk about in the class is some people thought that we should keep the slavery institution in place in the United States. Some of our founding fathers thought this. One reason is they thought if we end slavery, it's going to be really bad for the slaves because they won't be able to figure out how to live good lives in the new world. Um, well, okay, you might think, well, okay, that you ultimately think that was, sort of based on false assumptions about the slaves. We all know it turned out not to be true. Uh, so they had a good intention there, but their actions and then insisting on keeping slavery in place and not being for abolition, their actions were not morally good. Why? Well, because they led to bad results, right? They actually hindered the emancipation movement. And so you might think that's the kind of case, and we'll talk about other cases where good intentions aren't enough. That doesn't settle what's moral. We do want to have good intentions. Why? Well, they often lead us to perform the actions that actually lead to good results. But what matters is the results in the future, the consequences of what you do or don't do. So that's consequentialism. It's really giving you this forward-looking focus on the impact of what you do or don't do has in the world. Okay, the second component of utilitarianism is welfareism. Okay, welfare is just another word for well-being or happiness or having a good life, being benefited, not harmed. Uh, Again, we have a whole unit on that in the class. But the basic idea should make sense, right? Is your life going better or worse? How are things? Did you benefit or harm somebody, help or harm them? And so utilitarianism says that well-being always matters, and it's the only thing that matters. Okay, so now if you were to sit down Bentham or Mozart and say, why do you think well-being is so important, right? Well, here's the reason. Now, okay, imagine a ship's going down. You're trying to decide who gets to get on the lifeboats, right? You're like, well, this is a tough moral question. We can't, how do we decide who gets to get on the lifeboat? A bunch of people are going to die. Only some of the people are going to save. What do we do? Um, well, look, you could be like, well, the first class passengers should go first because people who live in the upper class, they're of noble blood. And so, it's morally good to let the people of noble blood go first. Okay, well, hopefully that sounds insane to you, like it does to most people nowadays. And that's what the kind of thing Bentham was like, that's crazy. We should just look at we want to get the people on the boat who are going to end up like leading to the most happiness in the future and minimize the harm. Like lots of people are going to die, lots of people are going to be harmed here. That sucks. Let's minimize that and maximize the good. It doesn't matter what class you're in. That's totally morally irrelevant. So one thing you do is when you say all and only well matters is you reject claims that things like social class or hereditary background are morally important. You're denying that. And so similarly in Asia, or I've got the Indian caste system, there are lots of societies where people have a pecking order and they think, oh, the people on the top of some hierarchy, their interests or well-being matters, but these other people's doesn't. And that's because we think, oh, there are these really important class distinctions that are morally important. Utilitarians typically, this is one of their big reformers, and they say this is wrong. We shouldn't think there's not some like moral importance to things like castes or something. They just think a lot of that stuff is not defensible. These groups don't even really, there's no good justification for putting people into the groups, but even if you did, they're just not morally important. Only well-being is important. So they want to reject contentious other factors some people will say are morally important and stick with well-being. Okay, so the last thing that they've got is they've got consequentialism. Look at how your actions impact the future. Just focus on the well-being in the future. And then they say, aggregate the well-being. Okay, what is aggregation? That's a word you could easily look up in the OED with that link I gave you. It just means to add together. So you have a bunch of things, and when you aggregate them, you put them together into a big pot. And so in this case, what it means is morality requires you to maximally increase the sum of well-being. So if you got a couple different actions to pick from, you look at each action and you're like, which one will lead to a future world with more well-being than the other options? You pick the one with the most well-being, and most just means you sum up everyone's well-being and look at the total. So that's what aggregation says, is you don't look at anything except for maximizing the most well-being. So those are the three components of utilitarianism. And so as Hare points out, a lot of utilitarians will say this is great because it says no one's well-being matters more or less. Um, and so one obvious thing here is, here's one way we put someone's well-being ahead of others. We put our own well-being ahead of everybody else, but that's a classic way of not being moral, right? So morality tells you don't put your own well-being ahead of other people's. You should treat it as equally important, not more important. That's the utilitarian view. But there are other things. They say how far away people are from you. So whether someone's starving in Africa or South America or Russia or Kansas, their poverty and their suffering is just equally bad. It doesn't matter where they are, it's equally bad. And so when you're trying to decide what you're going to do, you should treat everyone's well-being equally and just see your impact on that and aggregate it. And it doesn't matter where they are in the world or if they're on another planet or something. Look, their suffering is suffering. Similarly, it doesn't matter what their race, gender, class, caste are. It's not, so they would deny this Orwell thing. If you've read 1984, obviously this is not, this is sort of a similar idea. All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Uh, No, they say, look, those are all ways people have thought some people's well-being matters more than another, right? Those are all immoral ways of being prejudiced against some group or discriminating. So now the next step, you might be a little more reluctant to go along with. They say, look, same thing with species. So it doesn't matter if it's a cat or a dog or a human being or a chipmunk. If a creature can suffer, suffering is always bad. Living well is always good. And so what you should do is, from the moral point of view, is you have to take into consideration all the suffering that could be caused by your actions or all the good. And you should try to maximize the amount of good in the world. And that includes animals, not just human beings. Now, maybe the kinds of suffering animals have is not as bad as some suffering human beings can have. So there might be cases where you're going to prioritize one over another, but you don't want to leave them out. And so similarly, you don't want to trust your irrational emotions. You might think, oh, gross, a rat. I don't care about that. I don't care about that rat, whether it suffers. Maybe you want it to suffer and die. Okay, utilitarians say that's just a natural evolutionarily generated reaction. It's irrational. It's not morally relevant. From the moral point of view, suffering is bad. No creature deserves to suffer just because of the kind of creature it is, or the race we're in, or the gender we're in, how far away we are. Um, Suffering's always bad. We should always try to eliminate it. Well-being's always good. We should always try to promote it. And they say there's this tendency we have as human beings to say that human well-being is important, but animal well-being is not. And they say, really, that's no different than sexism or racism. So you can find sexists in the past or today who say men are more important morally than women and their well-being should be promoted before women's. You can find people who say that about races, right? And guess what? Probably most of you would agree with the utilitarians on those points. That seems wrong. And so the utilitarians' response and way of avoiding that is saying we should treat everyone's well-being equally. They think if your hunch is to still say animals shouldn't matter as much as human beings, they think this is really just the same phenomenon. It's speciesism. So it's not as universally condemned today, but like Appia pointed out, maybe what you should do is think about, is it really different? Why would you think it's okay to say well-being is more important if it's humans rather than animals, but you wouldn't say that's okay for these other groups? So that's the way they would put pressure on you to adopt their broad kind of egalitarian approach to well-being. All right, so I'm gonna have you take a break here. And what I want you to do is try to write your own words. You want to get your head around, maybe go back and review if you need to, or in the reading or whatever. You want to get those parts of utilitarianism clear in your own head. Okay. So write those down. You want to think about those. And then I want you to think a little bit, what do you think about this point about animal well-being? Do you think it's right that animal well-being should be included in moral thinking? Um, and so again, there might be questions about maybe human well-being is more weighty because we're capable of suffering in different ways or being happy in different ways than animals. We'll talk about that when we go forward. But their basic point is that animal well-being should count in the moral calculus of what you're going to do. So think about those and then come back for the second half. Hey everybody, so welcome back from the break. And we're going to move on to now talking about just utilitarianism as a moral theory, those terms we brought up at the beginning. You're going to want to start asking yourself, does the theory track your judgments about cases? Explain what's right to think about the cases. And if not, does it get part of the truth and can it improve your moral thinking? So the utilitarian standard is that morally right actions, the ones that result in the highest sum of well-being in the future world, and the actions that don't result in the highest sum of well-being are morally wrong. So that's the basic idea. And I've got a procedure here that you can apply to figure out how to do that. What you want to do is I call it the CHIMA procedure. You want to chart out the available acts or options you're choosing from or could choose from. Identify the people who will be benefited or harmed by each of those choices. Measure the impacts on well-being, and then aggregate the effects. So we're going to apply this, and you'll see how it works in a specific case. And we'll talk about the pond cases that were introduced last class. And so take the first case. You're walking around campus and you see a small child who is splashing around, is drowning in the pond. And what do? So the low-cost pond case we talked about, the first thing you would do with this procedure is you want to try to figure out what are the acts that are available to you. So here you could either save the kid or you could walk away. The second thing you're going to do is identify the people who are going to be benefited or harmed in each case. And so you have to use your own judgment. And so here I'd say, look, in each of these options, you will be impacted, your well-being, the kids' well-being, and the families. Um, and now, okay, what measure the impacts? And so here again, you're going to use your judgment about what you think about in the case you're trying to think about. And so I might say, well, okay, as I'm thinking about the case, if I save the kid, there's a small harm to me, namely my shoes are going to get destroyed, and that's not inconsequential, but it's a small harm. If I walk away from the kid, there's going to be an epic harm to the kid. We could say maybe he's going to die. That would obviously be an extreme harm, and a huge harm to the parents too. So those would be the impacts on well-being I'm envisioning on the two options. And then you aggregate them. So in this case, there's just one, so it's just still a small harm. In this case, you would add together the epic harm and the huge harm. And then to figure out which action is right, you look at the bottom, you look at the aggregated, and you say the right action is the one that has the least amount of harm and the most benefit, and the wrong ones are the other ones. So in this case, it's clear that according to this utilitarian theory, walking away is going to be wrong because it creates lots of harm. Saving the kid is going to be good because it does not create as much harm. And you might add in the happiness I would generate in the children too, but you get the basic idea that you can use this CHIMA procedure to chart out your options in a situation and calculate out in a rough and ready way what the utilitarian theory will say is right and wrong to do. And so now you could think, okay, now with that other case, the baby Hitler case, it was admittedly a bit far-fetched. You're out for a walk, you see a kid splashing around in the water, you know it's a baby Hitler. You know that for sure. It's before World War II. You can either save baby Hitler and then he will go on to create the Nazi party and cause the Holocaust, or if you walk away, he'll drown and the Holocaust will never happen. And so on the final think sheet, I'm going to ask you, I'll give you a chart to fill this out just so you get some practice at using this CHIMA procedure. You're going to want to identify people who are going to be impacted and harmed, measure the impact. So again, you can just use large, trivial, gigantic, epic. So just use words like that. Then you're going to aggregate it. So if many people are affected, you add all those together. And then you can determine which action will be right. Utilitarianism will just say pick the action that makes the world the best possible among the options in terms of aggregated well-being. So that's the utilitarian theory in a nutshell. And so now the other thing I wanted to talk about from the Hare, so the things you really want to be feeling like you got at this point is those three basic units from Hare's account of utilitarianism. And then you want to know how to use it with this CHIMA procedure. Are you seeing how this works? But now you might notice overall the utilitarians are saying the only thing that matters morally is beneficence, what produces the most well-being. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, intuitively in cases, we often also think about rights. And so you might wonder, what is that? This seems like an objection to utilitarians. If I'm trying to think about what to do with my roommate, I should worry about his rights and his right to autonomy and self-determination and not just think about beneficence. And so the one other thing from the Hare article I wanted to highlight is the way he initially gives you a strategy for thinking of how utilitarians deal with this. And it's the distinction between critical morality and intuitive morality. So critical morality is roughly the kind of morality that you would develop when you're trying to develop a moral theory, or you're in a moment of cool deliberation with perfect information. So Hare sometimes says this is the type of moral thinking angels would do, or godlike figures would do. And roughly they would apply the CHIMA procedure, knowing all the relevant information about who's going to be impacted and how much well-being and how it aggregates. The other thing is, since they're in a cool moment of deliberation with perfect information, you could picture they have a very good willpower and they're going to follow through and do the thing that they think is right. Okay, now in ordinary life, we often make decisions on the fly, and we're flawed people. We're not perfect. We rationalize, we're subject to our emotions. And so utilitarians say, if you want to know what the best action to do is, really from the ultimate truth is settled by what critical morality would say. But in our lives, we don't always have time, or it's not always the best plan for us to try to figure that out. And so instead they say there are rules of thumb, including thoughts about rights and respect for person, that can be a good plan for people to use in their moral deliberations, especially when they're pressed for time or if they're not fully mature. So think about kids. You might tell kids, never lie, never cheat, never steal. Those are totally morally wrong in every case. You should never do it. Now, you might know, okay, there are some cases where maybe it's better to tell the lie. And utilitarian would say, sure, there are cases where, you could tell a lie to someone and it's going to definitely lead to more good in the world. The issue is people will convince themselves they're in that situation and they'll start telling lies if you teach it that way. So you teach little kids really strict absolute rules and you expect them to use them initially, and then over time as they grow up they might learn, well, okay, I shouldn't necessarily always follow these rules, but they're good rules of thumbs to start from. And especially given that I might be too rushed to figure out all the details, they usually get the right answer. I'll just go with that if I don't have enough time. And since I know I'm flawed, I might need some kind of like help in figuring out how to do the right thing. And so in that way, they're not unlike rules or life hacks that people adopt in order to stick to diets or to battle bad habits. So if you go on social media all the time, you're not getting your work done, you're not studying, you might get an app like Freedom that blocks apps and websites so you can't go to Facebook or Twitter or whatever, Snapchat or whatever you do. You can't go, you can block yourself from doing it. And so you can't, if your thought is, I can't rely on myself to actually make good decisions in the run of the mill moment. I might be tempted to do bad things. I'm going to just set it up so I don't have that problem. That's kind of how these rules of thumb, like you teach kids never tell a lie. And that way they don't get into, you're not expecting them to engage in some complicated thinking. They'll just go with a simple answer. And so the utilitarians think from the point of view of critical morality, the actual moral best options are determined by beneficence and the procedure we've talked about. But they allow that it can be good to teach like little kids or people who don't have enough time to use rules of thumb. And so the second thing on the thing sheet here, you're going to be doing is thinking about the pawn case, and then I'm going to be asking about one rule of thumb, and you're going to be asking yourself, with that rule of thumb, if you taught that to kids or people use that in their ordinary thinking, do you think people relying on that would lead to increased welfare outcomes or not? And so you want to try to just get a little grip on this intuitive versus critical morality distinction. On top of the basics we've gone over. Next week, we'll go over objections to utilitarianism and we'll return to things in Hare that may have been hard to understand that we have not covered yet. So we're going to go back to that and I'll be going through very carefully and helping you understand it. So if you struggled a little with this reading, no problem. It was a challenging reading and we'll be going over the details and you'll have plenty of time to start understanding the objections to utilitarianism. The key now is to start to feel like you're getting a sense of how the theory operates. So that's it for today, and I will see you next week.